Well, thank you very much. As has been said, I'm Geraint Davies, and as has been mentioned, I chair the all-party group on air pollution, which is sort of relevant to this because something like 7 million people die a year from air pollution. But I'm also vice chair of the all-party China group, with particular responsibility for the environment and climate change, and sit on the AFRA committee. So just to sort of bring us back to basics, if you like, I think it's worth remembering in terms of the climate crisis that emissions since Kyoto 1990 have grown by 60%. We agreed in Paris that we tried to keep down the increase by 1.5 degrees, but in fact, versus the 1850 level, in fact, that's already 1.2 degrees and rising at 0.1 degree a year. So at the current trend, we're likely to breach the Paris commitment by 2025. And in fact, the increases in temperature over Europe are higher already than that. So instead of 1.5 degrees, it's 2 degrees over Europe, and in fact, 3 degrees over the Arctic. And what this in practice means is that as we speak today, every second, 8,500 cubic meters, 8,500 tons of ice is melting every second in Greenland. That's 1 trillion tons in the past 4 years, 4 trillion since 1993. So we really are accelerating at a phenomenal rate in terms of sea level rises, land loss, food loss, migration, and war. And 28% of emissions are from China. Now that's more than the EU and US put together. So the US 16%, the EU 10%. And then when you add in India at 7, Russia at 5, you get the 5 biggest countries have got 2/3, 64% of these emissions. And it's simply going out of control. I mean, the first bit of good news, of course, is that Trump is no longer causing climate change, and Biden is basically leading the US, and that can put fresh light on what's happening in terms of China, because the Belt and Road Initiative, by way of example, is generating an extra 300 new coal-fired power stations. Now, it's all very well saying that China is investing very heavily in renewables. It is, and I very much welcome that. But they've got over half the world's coal-fired production, and it's causing a bit of a problem in terms of climate change. In terms of the amount of emissions tons per head, we're now in a situation where the UK is at 5.5 tons per head, and in fact, China's up to 7. So they're producing more in China than we do in the UK. I think this is slightly unfair in a way, because obviously we've greened our energy and we've outsourced our manufacturing. So if you actually counted the UK in terms of consumption rather than production, we'd be at 8. And so this underlines the case, the imperative, I would say, for COP26 and beyond, to factor in carbon pricing into all trade deals in order to incentivize people or countries to produce greener products and accelerate away from a climate disaster that is really very much on our doorstep. So China, in a nutshell, China said, okay, and we just heard from the last speaker that they will not be net zero, by the way, but carbon neutral by 2060. Net zero is a different thing. It's carbon neutral being that they'll offset any carbon they will produce, as opposed to they won't produce carbon. But by 2060, well, in terms of the numbers I've just been given and the date ranges I've been talking about, namely 2025, that's not soon enough. And what's more, the Chinese are saying they will peak production at 2030. And one of the deficiencies of the Paris Agreement was that they didn't price in carbon. So we've got these countries that have got richness in coal in particular. I'm talking about China, India, and Australia, who incidentally, Australia, which is the highest carbon per person, it's 17.5 tons per person, have got an incentive to sort of keep on burning coal, which they are. And so China now has got an incentive to keep on burning more and more coal until 2030. Well, I mean, it simply isn't sustainable. And I know there's a conversation about, oh, are they going to use, are they going to get upset about what that's happening in terms of human rights abuse and democracy in Hong Kong and play this? And I'm sure they will. But, our imperative really is to build these imperatives in terms of carbon into our trade agreements and just get on with it. I sit on the Council of Europe, which basically stands up for human rights, rule of law and democracy. And I'm pushing through actually a resolution saying that all new trade agreements should embrace those values plus sustainability. And we are beginning from the EU to see some evidence that they are pushing forward on these agendas. Sadly, we're not in the EU anymore. Meanwhile, on the Chinese side, obviously, they've brokered the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is 2.2 billion people, 30% of the world's output. Not a lot about the environment in that. Alongside that, we've got the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and there are some environmental standards creeping into that. And more promising, and I know Sam rightly said it's been put on ice, but was the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment between China and Europe. And of course, Europe is a bit more serious about these issues in terms of sustainability, transparency, non-discrimination, access to markets, and actually compliance with Paris, as well as human rights. And we should be, on pushing forward that agenda in COP26, because, China in those negotiations has been agreeing to implement the Paris Agreement. And it's all very, and this is going to be done in practice, not in words, as I've been trying to say. And it has said it will comply with the organization, the International Labour Organization conventions, including forced labour. The other thing, obviously, we're concerned about is the abuse of Uyghur Muslims and forced labour and this sort of thing. Obviously, we can't tolerate that. And there's a lot of progress on that on state-to-state dispute resolution as well. So that's good news. Meanwhile, of course, the EU are considering a carbon adjustment and border tax, so that imports coming in can be taxed so that they fulfill the same regulatory regime as domestic production. Because otherwise we've got a situation as we have in Britain where we basically close down steelworks or whatever it is in order that it's burnt more dirtily abroad, in particular in China. Well, that we share the same world. That shouldn't be permissible. And again, the EU are taking a welcome lead. It's great standards. We're not part of the EU. They're also pushing forward on the sustainable finance disclosure regulations, because pension funds and pensioners and other asset managers should know that they may face stranded assets, fossil fuel risks, as well as human rights risks, and people should it should be transparent. And again, hopefully, this will actually turn down the financial flows from the City of London and elsewhere into dirty production, including from China. Although obviously China is funding obviously its own coal fire stations, as I've mentioned earlier. So it's important that we continue again in COP26 down this environment, social and governance route. And in terms of, finally, in terms of, what are we therefore saying for COP26 is, basically the world isn't taking this seriously enough. The growth in China isn't sustainable. It's all very well saying, oh, well, US grew in the past, etc. They're nearly at 30% of total production. 2060 isn't soon enough. And we need to act unilaterally and obviously collectively to have trade deals that factor in and price in carbon. And obviously it's being hosted by the UK. So this is a great opportunity for the UK to show some leadership. But of course, the UK has become a lot weaker thanks to Brexit, because we're standing alone. We're not part of Team EU negotiating with big players like the US or with China. And we've just seen in the G7 where Biden came forward alongside all the other G7 countries, with an idea of a 21% corporation tax for Amazon and Google and Facebook and the like. And it was watered down to 15% by the British, presumably by a bit of arm twisting outside the room. So it is concerning. We do need to act, and all our futures depend on this. And China, to be fair, has done a lot, but it does need to do a great deal more if we're going to be sustainable. And this is partly negotiation, but partly ultimately saying this is the deal and getting on with it. And it may mean that economies suffer in terms of prices and the like. But I mean, the stakes are high. We're talking about everybody's future. We've just got to get on with it. Thank you.